Morning, everybody. Talking here recently about AI, artificial intelligence, and I think it's something that everybody needs to learn more about. How can you use AI for the better? For example, um, I was curious. Yesterday I was like thinking about safety on the roads and the drivers, and who are these crazy drivers. And I just wanted to ask a general question, of AI. So I went to Google. Google has an AI feature. And I typed in how many illegal immigrants are involved in accidents in the U.S. You know, Something that I think AI should be able to answer. Well, AI did answer, and it said it didn't know. And it said it didn't know because the government doesn't track it. So the state governments are issuing driver's license to illegal immigrants, but what they're not tracking is how many illegal immigrants are involved in accidents. You would think that would be pretty basic. They always seem to track every piece of information about you as a consumer. They know your buying habits. They know uh, your personal information. They know what you like, what you don't like. They give tailored advertisements to your uh, news feed and targeted advertising when you use Facebook and YouTube and all these algorithms based on data that the government collects on you. They know your voting patterns. They know everything about you. Okay, but for some reason they don't know how many illegal immigrants are involved in accidents. And they're not tracking it. AI said it's an interesting question, but they're not tracking it. And then it leads to like, why aren't they tracking it? And of course, this is politics, right? Uh, they the government here, depending on what type of administration you have, doesn't want you to know. You know, if you knew, for example, that there was a high percentage of accidents caused by illegal immigration, then that would cause you naturally to use common sense and say, well, maybe we shouldn't give driver's license to illegal immigrants. Or, how many people who are involved in truck accidents don't speak English? If you're not tracking that information, you can't get the answer. AI is a great tool, but it's only based on data. So if the government decides it doesn't want you to know the answer, it doesn't provide the data. And how else can you get the data if the government isn't tracking it? So this is very frustrating. And I think it's willful. I think it's by design that they're not tracking it. You know, DOT wants to track every second you are operating the truck through electronic logs. Why can't they track how many illegal immigrants have accidents or involved in accidents? They just don't track it. They don't want to track it. They don't want you to know. If they weren't trying to hide something, then they would track it. You know, it's always like the news station says, "Oh, a man, uh, was involved in some kind of crime." Okay, but they don't want to tell you who the man was. They don't want to tell you their ethnicity. They don't want to tell you the country of origin. They don't want to tell you their height, their weight, or anything like that. Because they're afraid that you're going to form an opinion about that man. They're like, "Oh, it's an illegal immigrant." They don't want you. They don't want you to know. They're just like, a man, a generic man. Could be any man. Just some man out of the blue. And that's kind of how like they're tracking accidents. They're like, "Oh, a 32-year-old man was involved in an accident." And you're like, "Okay, well, was that man illegal or illegal?" They won't tell you. Why won't they tell you? They don't want you to know. They're not tracking it, and they don't want the public to form an opinion, and they don't want you to form a policy that is contrary to their political interest. There's a great debate right now going on about the consensus. The government does a consensus like every 10 years, right? And they determine how many House of Representatives each state gets based on the consensus. And the consensus is based on the population of each state. Well, if you have illegal immigration, then that raises your population, and then you get more representatives for your state. But what they want to do now is challenge this and say, okay, I know you got millions and millions of people in your state, but how many of those are actually Americans versus illegal immigrants? Well, that changes things, right? If you knew that 25% of the population was here illegally, then you wouldn't count that in your census, and you wouldn't get as many representatives for that state. So this is some of the games that's being played with data. It's just like I don't disagree that there's millions of people in your state, but how many are actually Americans? you know, this is kind of important, because whether California gets a large number of representatives versus another state like Texas, you would be like, well, maybe you favor one or the other, but what's fair? Because California has sanctuary cities and allows mass immigration, is that fair? I don't think that's fair. Why should they get more representatives in the House of Representatives than another state like Texas? If Texas is doing it right, why should they be punished? It's things like this. So, the data is very important. You have to have data integrity. Those numbers have to be available and they have to be factual. If you got crappy data, then you're going to get crappy results when you ask AI a question. You're like, how many people live in California? They're just like, well, there's so many millions. He was like, okay, well, how many of those are actually Americans? Oh, we don't know, because we're not tracking that. Why aren't you tracking that? Well, he's like, we don't want to track that. We don't want the public to know how many illegals are actually being counted in the census. How many illegal immigrants are driving on our roads? Oh, we don't know. You don't know? You're issuing licenses and you don't know. I mean, come on now. You're tracking. You should be tracking this. But they don't want to track it. So when DOT to the drivers, you better be safe. We're watching every second you're doing on your ELDs. You're a bad driver. It's like, what? You're over regulating the good drivers, and you're not even watching illegals. That's like, you people are ridiculous. It's like, how serious can I actually take you when you don't take the data? You're not tracking the data. That data could be excruciatingly important. People want to know, how many illegal immigrants are involved in accidents in the U.S. What I did find was AI provided some statistics on drunk driving, and they found that illegal immigrants have a higher percentage of driving under the influence than other ethnic groups. They break it down like what percentage of white drivers and Asian drivers and African American drivers and male drivers, female drivers, and then illegal immigrant drivers. And they found the illegal immigrants much higher percentage. I think it was like, I don't want to do an exact number, but it was in the teens, percentage-wise, were driving under the influence. And so there is some indication there that a larger percentage of illegal immigrants are driving in an unsafe way compared to the rest of the population. But they can't tell you how many illegal immigrants are involved in accidents because they're not tracking the information. So here's an example where AI is a super powerful tool, but it's limited by the integrity of the data. So if there's missing data or data is not being tracked, or you don't have data integrity, you're not going to get good results. Garbage in, garbage out. That's the idea with AI. It's interesting because you could use AI in a very constructive way, but if you got a government that is trying to hide information from the public, then AI is not going to help you. You're going to have to find your data somewhere else, and that's a real shame. I think that's unfortunate. I mean, you could use AI to hold your politicians accountable. You're like, uh, you know, if you look at the voting patterns of your elected representatives and you have data to support your argument, then you could present that to your representative and maybe persuade them to vote in a certain way. But if there's no data, then your argument is falls flat. It's like, I want my congressman to introduce a new piece of legislation that says illegal immigrants should not be issued driver's license, and here's the data to back it up. So that there's some support for that. It says, like, out of every 100 accidents involved on the road, 10% of it's called by illegal immigrants. Well, we don't know that because the government's not tracking it. So this I think is willful. The government doesn't want you to know. I mean, if they wanted you to know, they would track it. Evidently, they don't want you to know, so they're not tracking it. And it's like, why would you not track it? You track everything. I mean, they probably know more about you than the Russians do, or the Chinese. The U.S. government is, snooping on everything you do. The Patriot Act gives the government, powers that then infringe on your rights of privacy. They know everything about you. If you use social media, uh, and you're not living under a rock, they probably know more about you than you know about yourself. But for some reason, they're like, nope, we can't track illegal immigrants. And how many of them are involved in an accident? It's hard to believe. It's really hard to believe. It's like, you track everything. You don't track that? Nope, we don't track it. Do you think it's not important? No. It's just that they don't want you to know. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.